Good morning, everyone. This is Kathy Mason from MasonWorks Marketing here on Conscious Business Zone with my friend Merrie Wycoff. Hi,
Hello,
Merrie.
Kathy. Good morning.
Morning. So I have to say I am being selfish today with the Conscious Business Zone because I missed Marie's presentation at SSE in Boulder, which is the Society for Scientific Exploration, and everyone raved about it. So I asked her if she would be so if we would be honored to have her do her presentation about Egypt, because I think unveiling the mysteries of ancient Egypt is a huge part of our missing history. Do you agree?
I absolutely agree. And I should preface this by saying I started my journey into ancient Egypt when I was 10 years old.
Wow.
And so I then earned my Egyptology certificate. It's a 3-year program. And it's very left brain, that they have us regurgitate facts. And certainly, of course, the joke is that Egyptology is only as ancient as the latest dig until we find somebody else digging up something that completely refutes all the facts that we were taught, and we find something older. Mm-hmm. So it was interesting to me that I took a very left brain approach. And then I was fortunate enough to go to Egypt, and I got to study with an ancient Egyptian wisdom keeper. And he taught me a very right brain, completely different, more about the mystery of the history of Egypt. So I wanted to talk a little bit, and that's what my presentation is about in my slides. I want to give you an idea of what we learn in Egyptology versus what the true wisdom keepers teach us. And he says his lineage goes back more than 50,000 years.
So you said you became an Egyptologist. Was there a college degree that you could take at a U.S.
Manchester
college?
University? And, it's an extensive 3-year program where you're writing papers and learning about different museums and what the artifacts are. And it's taught to us. In fact, one of the interesting things is Professor Barry Kemp was one of the ones I often cited in my papers because he's very famous and considered, he wrote one of our curriculum books. And I was fortunate enough to meet him when I got onto the Amarna Research Foundation, TARF, and he was the professor which we funded to do the dig in Amarna, which is where Pharaoh Akhenaten, his palace was. And then he was a contemporary of mine.
Wow. I had something a little similar where I studied in Italy, and the professor that wrote the books that we worked on for the Renaissance he was my professor, and they recorded every class and used it for periodicals, and I just was a dumb college kid signing up for a class in Italy, in Florence.
So did you do it while you were in college?
Mm-hmm.
Me too. I studied at the University of Florence, art and culture.
We have that in common.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. So back to Egypt. Excuse me. I'll let you have full screen again. I'm sorry, I just had to jump in there and how did you do that? Okay.
Okay, are we ready to start our slideshow?
Sure.
Very good. Let's do Unveiling the Mysteries, and I'll tell you when to switch slides. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. So this is the wisdom keeper. He's world famous. You might have heard of him. He's Abdel Hakim Awan, and he's an elder, an indigenous wisdom keeper of the oral traditions of the Ai tribe, and he's considered the keeper of the keys of the Giza Plateau. And what he taught us was the living African traditions. And what he explained is in the last half of the 20th century until now, over all the continents of Earth, the wisdom keepers have stepped forward. The Vedic, Tibetan, Mayan, Aztec, Hopis, many of you probably are part of these lineages. Well, they started coming forth with their oral traditions, which had previously had been privy to their own tribes. Now, Hakim is well studied, and he earned a degree from Cairo University in archaeology, and then he went on to do his Egyptology graduate work in Leiden University in the Netherlands. And Hakim stated that he was chosen by the female elders of the tribe to carry on the oral tradition, which goes back thousands of years before the written word. And unfortunately, I was on one of the last trips with Hakim, and he passed away in 2008. You go to the next slide. So Hakim had a very interesting way of teaching us. I explained it. Egyptology is very left brain. Hakim taught us very right brain. And what he was very gifted at is that he was able to turn on the senses. So here he is turning on my senses. And I was very fortunate because when Hakim and I went to multitudes of temples, we'd kind of go to the back. He'd tap me on my third eye. And I was fortunate and psychic enough to be able to see what Egypt would have looked like at that time. So I could see the colors of the temple walls, and I could smell the smells, and I could watch the people passing by and what they wore and heard remnants of conversations. And so it was a very transformative experience for me. And I thought, that is a perfect way to really learn about the mystery of history. Go to the next slide, please. So, of course, Egyptology, it's the science and humanity that studies historical human cultures through architecture, antiquities, language, which falls under the larger discipline of archaeology and anthropology. Next slide. So where did that all begin? Started with Jean-Francois Champollion. And Napoleon had his conquest of Egypt in June 1st, 1778, and he landed in Alexandria. And from what we know, what we're taught, I guess I should say, is that the Sphinx, why does the Sphinx not have a nose? It is said that Napoleon's armies would take target practice, and they're the ones who actually blew the nose off the Sphinx. Well, as we come later to find out, according to Salima Ikram, who's a professor of Egyptology at the American University in Cairo, who I was fortunate enough to meet, Napoleon actually held the Sphinx and the pyramids in high esteem, and he never used them as a means of urging his troops to greater glory. He said that he did not take pot shots at him, and that quote is published in November 22nd of 23. So that's a complete wrong interpretation that we're being told. You go to the next one. Now, Jean-Francois Champollion, when the French discovered the Rosetta Stone, this is a picture of the Rosetta Stone, in 1799, you may have heard of it. It's Champollion labored 20 years to decipher the same transcription of a single passage. So one was written in hieroglyphics, the other is written in Demotic, and the other is Greek. And it took them 20 years to decipher this passage. And that was pretty profound. It gave us a whole understanding of hieroglyphics after that. And Hakim would say that the Rosetta Stone was a form of propaganda because it was a Greek interpretation of the ancient symbols from an outsider's point of view for a language that is steeped in layers and layers of sacred symbolism. So the ancient Greek inscription, what I just recently found out, declared that its readers must hail Ptolemy V as the god who maketh himself manifest, whose deeds are beautiful. Well, Ptolemy V, a Greek kind of invader of Egypt, certainly would have been considered a barbarian by the Egyptians because it was foreign rule over their country. Okay, go to the next. So these are hieroglyphics, and they look very mysterious. And what we have learned is that they are steeped in sacred symbolism because hiero means higher, Glyphics means text. So what we're really looking at are sacred texts. And there were 3 layers, as Akeem explained to us. The first was to the uninitiated, people who couldn't read or write. And so there is some very simple languaging. The next is steeped in sacred symbolism. So that next would have been for the priests and the scribes. And the third would have been for the highly initiated, people who understood the metaphors of what some of these sacred symbols mean. Okay, go ahead. But Akeem would always tell us if it had to be written down, it was corrupt. And it was used as a tool of control. It was used as a tool of propaganda. And so we had to think about that. So why, if theirs is an oral tradition that goes back 50,000 years, why would something that's being written down, which seems pretty final, right? If you're going to take the time to etch it into stone, why would they use it as a form of corruption? Well, the first people who learned how to read and write were called the Hanut. And the Hanuti used what was in the papyrus and on the temple walls as propaganda. And it was simply directions of who to marry and what to eat, when to plant, funerary rites. And so Egyptologists, we keep looking for the most ancient texts, the most ancient papyri to find the truth. And Akeem again would say, no, once it's written down, it was distorted. And why? Because if it was written down, that meant that we lost our connection to the gods. We lost our connection direct to source to be able to tell it in an oral tradition from mother to child, mother to child, mother to child, because most children learn at the knees of their mother. And so the ancient rituals, texts, and procedures came in during the age of Aries, and that was the age of Amun the Ram. So if you look at this piece, you see who is in the bark of the sun. That's Khnum, and Khnum is the ram-headed god. And so that was during the age, the ram, it's the stubborn one. It's the one who needs control. And so who right there in the picture, who is he talking to? He's talking to a snake. And that snake, you can see it winding around the opening of the door. And then down below, you see the snake. And that snake is very famous, and it's called the Apophis. And he's the Egyptian demon god of chaos. And it had the form of a serpent as the foe of the sun god Ra. And it represented all that was outside the ordered cosmos. So I thought that was interesting because when I gave my presentation to SSE, we had just come out of the solar equinox in October. And one of the asteroids that was coming was the Apophis. And the Apophis is also known as the world destroyer. So we're going to have to keep our eye on that asteroid, meteorite, whatever they want to call it. I think that, I think we may be hearing more about that one. Go to the next one. So this is Herodotus, and he's called the father of history. But Akeem will also tell you he's also called the father of lies. And back in 440 BCE, Herodotus gave an account of Egypt in his 3rd book called the Histories. And this book was one of the oldest to survive and had a huge influence on the way Egyptology is currently taught. Again, Akeem would tell us that even this Greek patriarchal interpretation is in conflict with the ancient wisdom keeper's account of what happened in ancient Egypt. He was an outsider. So if he went to the priests and they would tell him these grand stories, and of course he would write them down, believing every word of them, because he would have believed that they would have had actual eyewitness accounts. Akeem would tell us that writing was corrupt. It was controlled, and that Herodotus was looking for the truth of the most ancient texts. No, again, he lost his connection to the gods. Go to the next slide. So what was written down is that Egyptologists and Herodotus believed that the pyramids were built for Pharaoh Khufu, and they stand 481 feet high, 754 feet square at the base, and it rises at a consistent 51-degree angle. And it was originally covered in polished white limestone that must have been brilliant with the sun reflecting off of it. And the Great Pyramid is made of 2.5 million limestone blocks weighing an average of 2.5 tons. And the common belief, which Herodotus propagated, is that in the literature that wood ramps were used to haul the stones. And the stones came from quarries miles and miles away. And what Akeem would tell us, well, there were no hardwood trees that existed in ancient Egypt. Cedar were the trees that were there, and they were softwood. So they wouldn't have had any hardwood trees in which to bring up. The stones, another one of the illusions that was written down is that the pyramids were built for the pharaohs and the kings as tombs. And again, Akeem would say absolutely not. And I'll tell you why later, that the proof that completely refutes that idea. But there has never been any inscription or any pharaoh found in any tomb. So go to the next one, please. I want you to look at this piece of red granite, which those are my pictures that stand on the Giza Plateau, and appears to have been tooled by modern machine because it shows a precision greater than modern requirements. So any stone mason, Kathy Mason, might tell you that it would take lathes, tubular drills, or ultrasonic machining, which must have been used to create blocks of this enormity. And so researcher Christopher Dunn reports that some ancient workings of granite, basalt, and alabaster, including this piece, are shown with a precision and tolerances of 2/10,000ths of an inch. So they might have used a diamond drill with the precision of this OG. And that, remember, we're back in the Stone Age, right? So look at the cog. Look, that's pretty unusual. And look at the hole drilled perfectly through nearly 2 feet. Hakeem believes that the pyramids were built more than 65,000 years ago. And of course, we don't learn that in school. Next slide, please. So look at this. This is an anti-gravity machine found in the pyramid now in the Cairo Museum. And this is a volcanic plate of schist stone, and it produced sound vibration. And Akeem said that stonecutters in Aswan near red granite quarries use this to cut stone and to elevate them and to lift them out. So there we have a piece of proof. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, we should talk about, where does the word Egypt come from? Egyptos, which is a Greek word, which means He-je-patos. And of course, the ancients in Egypt would actually refer to their land as Khemit. Khemit, Khemit, or Kemet, because we only say KMT because the vowels are sacred and silent. So Egypt, Khemit, is a country in North Africa, and it's based on the Greek word Egyptos. And Khemit, is also an Arabic word, and it's where we get the word alchemy. It's also where we get the word chemistry. And so we're always taught that it comes from the black lands, the black soil, the black alluvial soil that's washed up from the Nile. But could it also be a reference to the people that existed in Africa? Next slide, please. So this is Ptah. And we usually see Ptah carved in many kind of stone, but the one that I liked was the lapis lazuli, which made him a blue. So let me break down what the word Egypt stands for. Egypt, Egyptos, he or het means place, ji means ka or the astral projection, and patos means the Ptah or God. So the place where the projection of the god Ptah manifested is an inscription. And we find that in Memphis, which is Min Nefer. And that's the only place that we find that inscription. So that word Egypt, Egyptos, only comes from Min Nefer. But let's go further. So Ptah we find him in blue, in a cobalt blue. So that is reference to the planet Sirius, which is called Sothis, or interestingly enough, Sa Ptah. So it literally means that Ptah came from Sirius. Let's go to the next slide, please. So this is the depiction of the 42 tribes, and the 42 tribes is a very magical number in Khemit. And Khemit was originally made up of the 42 original tribes or kingdoms composed of all known races and people. And these tribal lands and people remained important in dynastic times, and it's where the 42 nomes or governed areas of Egypt came from. So Hakeem would call these people his beloved people, he would call them the sesh, always referred to as the sesh. Even if you YouTube Akeem, he will refer to his people as the sesh, all known people that represented in Khemit. My second Khemitian teacher, my mentor, when I said, well, we talk about the sesh, and he would say, Merrie, do you understand that is a very derogatory term for the people? And I said, how so? And he goes, I want you to figure it out. But the sesh is called an unfired vessel. What is an unfired piece of pottery? So I had to really think about that. What would be an unfired piece of pottery? Well, an unfired piece of pottery couldn't hold light and it couldn't hold water. So it was unformed yet. It wasn't solid. It hadn't been put through those spiritual fires of initiation and testing. And I got the approval on that. So what he's talking about are the masses, and sometimes the people were not educated. They were considered illiterate, the profane, that this is what the priests referred to them as, because only a small percentage in people in Khemit could ever read and write. And of course, that was the royalty and the priestly caste. They could ever read and write. So they would use the hieroglyphics as a form of metaphor and depiction of the sacred texts so that people could decipher them at the lowest levels. Next slide, please. So the Suf language of Khemit, as spoken by the Sesh, may have been the original language spoken by everyone on this planet. So Arab spoken today is 80% Khemitian and 20% Hebrew. And the Hebrews entered in 200 AD. And Fabre de Olivet, a French scholar in 1815, wrote The Hebraic Tongue Restored. And he argued that the Hebrew language of the Old Testament was fully derived from the ancient Khemitian language. For instance, Adonai means Lord. It comes from Adonai or Adonai, which in Hebrew means bright and dazzling light. And Shem is the same in both language, and it means emanation. Next slide. So let's talk about the pantheon of gods. This is interesting in Egyptology. We get to look into who are these ancient gods. There's a whole pantheon, and certainly far beyond these. It's a confusing amount. So why worship so many? I think that's one of the big questions that we always ask as students is why did they have to worship so many gods and goddesses? And Akeem would explain that during Atlantis times, we lived in monotheism. So that's when we had full consciousness. And so we had a direct line to source. So let's talk about what that would mean in Atlantis time. If you have direct line to source, that means you would be telepathic. That means that you certainly couldn't lie because all your deceit would be revealed. So if I looked at you and said, oh, I love that blue shirt. Blue's my favorite color, but secretly I'm thinking, no, I like green. Well, the person on the receiving end would absolutely hear that and know that you were lying. So when we were in monotheism, mono meaning one God, one theism, one theology about how we worship, well, then we fell into consciousness. And we forgot who and what we were imagine when Atlantis in that great cataclysm went under. So if we fell in consciousness, that means our consciousness was split. And that's why we needed so many gods and goddesses. So let's talk about the gods and goddesses. Akeem would say that they're called the Neteru or the Neters or the Najaru. And there were 360 degrees of gods and goddesses. So 360 degrees of God and goddesses. Later, I've discovered there were 180 disagreeable and on the material plane and 180 in the agreeable in the spiritual plane. Keem would say that we used to have 360 senses. If you can imagine that. Certainly today we know of our 5 senses. And then if you watch that famous movie, I See Dead People, we know that there's a 6th sense. So if there's a 6th sense, what I put it out to the other group was, well, then what other senses are? You could have a sense of knowing. My husband had a sense of direction. He could always just stand anywhere, be turned around, and he would always know where due north was. And so if you can imagine, I'm going to put the question out to you. Do you have any idea what other senses we could possibly have? I'll give you a few. We're certainly learning in the Marvel movies, we could see telekinesis. We can see the control of weather. We can see telechronos, where they can move forward and backward in time. A sense of knowing. And I'm just going to leave that question, maybe put it in the chat room, of what other senses do you think that we may be able to have? And what I just discovered was that on December 21st of 24, we finished up our 180 degrees of the material plane. And now we're moving into 180 degrees of the spiritual plane. So I think we're going to start see an acceleration of the ability to have telepathic conversations and people levitating. And who knows? I'm going to leave that up to your ideas. Let's go to the next slide. So this is a really interesting scene. So let's break this down. At first, on first glance, we can certainly see that Osiris, and he's the one with the green skin, and green is the color of Orion, so that's saying that he comes from Orion, and he's wearing the Atef crown, and those which are usually symbolized by ostrich feathers, being flames. And so he's sitting on the throne. And if you know the story of Osiris and Isis, his wife's behind him, but their son is to the right, and he has the hawk head. And Horus in Khemit is called Heru, and Heru is the Greek word for hero. It's where we get the word hero. And he is the son who defended his father against his father's brother, Horus's uncle, Set, who tricked Osiris into getting into the sarcophagus. And then he closed the sarcophagus and chopped it up into pieces and threw him into the ocean. And then Horus and then Isis had to revive him. But in front of the Pharaoh, in front of Osiris is the Pharaoh, and he's coming to get a blessing, right? So you would think, because Osiris is on the throne, that he is the one who's going to give the blessing. But I want you to look to the woman behind Osiris, and that's Isis. And we know that's Isis because she's wearing a throne on her head. And that means that the throne of Khemit must come through the woman, and that Isis gave the power of the throne to Osiris because it was a matrilineal system in Africa. And Akeem would call Isis, or any woman who's the head of the household in ancient Egypt, call her the Khemeti. And the Khemeti is she who has the last word. And I'll bet any of you out there who have children in your house will know that, yes, it's she who has the last word when raising children. Go to the next slide, please. So I wanted to talk about that. So we hear the word Pharaoh. And so everybody talks about the pharaohs, the kings of Egypt. But that didn't actually refer to the man. It referred to the woman. And so she was known as the Per'ot. And the Per'ot was called the high house because, again, the throne comes through the woman. So let's talk about the different houses and what they represent. And this was very important, as Akeem pointed out. The Perka is the house of the body. So that meant that it was a tomb. And so the tombs would be, the Malkata Palace used to have a huge funerary temple behind it. And that's where Amenhotep III was buried. So that would be a tomb. But a per ba is the house of the soul, and that is a temple. So Luxor, Karnak, those would be famous temples that you might have visited. Dindara is another famous temple. And a pernetter is a house of nature, or a pyramidos, means fire in the middle in Greek, but that is what a pyramid is. So we know that if it was a house of nature or a generator for energy, that there's no way the ancients would have made a pernetter into a perka, or a place for a body or a tomb. So the next one is a perweir, and it means house of the wise man, or great house. And the wise men is probably where they held the mystery schools. And the last one I think is kind of fun. That took me a long time to discover. It's called the perneferu. And a perneferu is called the house of beauty. And so one would think it would be maybe that's where they got their wigs made, or the beautiful makeup, or the kohl eyeliner. No, actually discover that a house of beauty actually is a charnel house. And a charnel house is where they actually mummified the dead bodies. And it wasn't all pristine. There were a great many flies there, and bodies left to rot because maybe they got to them 2-3 weeks down the line by the time they were bloated. So it wasn't necessarily a house of beauty, but it is where they removed the brain from the nose with the little tools, and then they started to embalm them in the house of beauty, the charnel house. Let's go to the next slide, please. So again, another question is, how did it all begin? How did all this unusual religion begin in ancient Egypt? And what was that time period that this happened? And what Egyptologists discovered, not connecting necessarily the two, is that a meteorite struck the Siwa Desert and sent radiating streams of energy along the land. And that's the way the ancient temples, or purbas, were formed. And that is how the people originally discovered that when they came upon a source of crystal and running water along these streams of energy, they'd have a transformative experience. Certainly anyone who's been to Egypt can tell you that they have had transformative experiences, that it just seems to be one of the power sites of the world in order to shift and change consciousness. So if they came upon some crystal and some streams of water, well, over time, they began to mark those, and they would put some stones upon that place saying, here, like, stop here. You know, this is a site you want to check out. And then the Hanuti started saying, you know, we better start protecting these. So then they would build altars on them, and it was open to all. Everybody could feel the energy. But as more and more travelers came by, they thought, you know, somebody's going to have to sleep here and take care of it, because we don't want these crystals and stones to be taken. So then they started to erect temples, great temples upon these sites. And then the people were actually excluded from shifting their consciousness. Now it became a place where they had to protect consciousness. They had to deem who was worthy to receive a change in consciousness. So these altars were built on igneous rock, basalt, granite, or alabaster. And they would begin to meditate and chant and commune with higher powers and have an altered experience. And then they began to refer to that as the Holy of Holies, available to all. So then when the Hanuti decided to tend it, they would build walls around their altars and keep them safe and protected. But I want to talk about that Siwa. When that meteorite hit, it came with such high temperatures, if you can imagine the power it hit in the desert, that it created what was called Siwa glass. And if you look in the lower corner of the desert picture, there is some picture of some very famous Siwa glass, and I was fortunate enough to get a piece. And so this is highly valued and known as a collector's item. And go to the next slide. And look in the center of King Tut's pectoral. Right, that's a piece of Siwa glass. So you can see how highly prized it was. And it was recognized that it carries some transformative energy. So if you can imagine a pharaoh, King Tut, but probably not necessarily just belonging to Tut, as I'll explain. When you wore that against your heart, can you imagine the transformative energy? Let's go to the next slide. So if we had a fall in consciousness, where we were at the stage of enlightenment, is called the stage of the Aten. It's where the sun shone upon the people, and the stage of enlightened, where we had those 360 degrees of all our senses activated. Okay, if we fell into consciousness, we also forgot how to bury our dead. What happens to the dead bodies? Well, the people would just lay them out in the desert, of course, to be baked by the sun. And that is another way of kind of drying out or mummifying a body. The problem was that the jackals would come and dig up the bodies, and they were known as the body eaters. And so if you can imagine, if you just laid out Aunt Susan, and then all of a sudden you see a jackal coming and running away with an arm, it was quite disturbing to the people. So they started building little wooden structures around them, and they called these sarcophagus, which Hakeem actually explained to us that it means body eater. And they were to prevent the jackals from taking the bodies, because they believed that the bodies had to remain intact, because that was how reincarnation happened. The soul actually had to have a body in order to animate again and achieve reincarnation. So you can see how significant this truly was. So if we forgot how to bury our dead, what happens to the bodies after death? What happens to the consciousness after death? And Hakeem would say that we fell from the height of consciousness in the age of enlightenment into the age of darkness, the age of Amen. And interestingly enough, in ancient Egypt, there is no word for life and death. The word for birth is actually easting, when the sun rises in the east. And the word for death is westing, where the sun sets in the west. And so, of course, they would bury the bodies with their heads to the west. So I got to say, it's quite disturbing if you begin to learn all this, when you go into museums and you certainly see mummies and you see the dead skeletons that they have dug up. And because as Egyptologists, they don't know the sacred ritual, I have gone into so many museums where I have certainly seen that they did not position the heads to the west. And so I think that's something we should pay attention to. If you dig up the bodies, you need to mark what direction were they turned towards the sunset. And so that needs to be reproduced in museums around the world. So I want you to look at the symbol to the right. That's called the Mesu. It's a very important symbol, because the Hanuti started creating rituals and texts and papyri, and you can see on the walls of the temples and the tombs, they would put this symbol, and it means that the jackal is dead, the jackal is dead, the jackal is dead. They would say it 3 times, and those little symbols are jackal skins. And so it is one of the prayers that they would say to prevent the jackal from eating their ancestors. Go to the next slide, please. So how did the Hanuti, how did religion kind of begin? Is they thought, well, if we're doing all the work of burying the dead, they would go to the farmers and say, you produce way more than you could possibly ever eat. Why don't you give 10% of that to the church, to the religious temple? And in exchange, we will perform the rituals for you. We will take over all the rights of things that you need, the yearly blessings on the crops and the inundation of the Nile. We'll take all of that over. And so why don't you produce the wheat? You bake the bread. In fact, bake it into the shape of a nose. A nose would be good because when the people would smell the baking bread, they would know that it'd be time to go to temple and to bring their tithes and to bring their offerings. So it was the beginning of accepting offerings and indulgences. And that's where it kind of originated. Go to the next slide, please. And so here would be one of the temples. It's my demonstration of what a temple around, that's Philae, and it's on the Nile. So perhaps that's one of the streams where the energy came in and it had to be protected. Let's go to the next slide. So we talk about the age of Amen, the age of darkness. This pharaoh is the one who represents the age of light. And he is known as Pharaoh Akhenaten. And I'm going to tell you that this is where my journey began. Because when I was on my school class trip, 10, 11 years old, to the Rosicrucian Museum, where we were studying Egypt for the first time, as all classes do, we went in and started looking at the artifacts. And one of the replicas of, or one of the original colossi of this pharaoh was sitting in a position that was accessible back then. And I went and kissed it on the lips. And I said, I vow to tell the truth. I was 10 or 11 years old. I didn't know what the truth was. I couldn't possibly know what the truth was. I just knew that when I went through the rest of the exhibit and we were looking at the little dioramas of the slaves pulling the blocks up to the pyramid, I was telling the class teacher, that can't possibly be true. That's not true. And that's not true. And look at mummy in this little pyramid. That's not true. I don't know how I knew that at the time, but I was pretty sassy about it. And so I knew that it was the start of a journey for me. It was the start of opening up my wonderment about ancient Egypt. And I read everything I possibly could. And I will explain who his consort is next, but I kind of want you to look at this pharaoh's face. And maybe you have seen him before. He's famous because in school, we learned that he has Marfan's disease, Marfan's syndrome. And that's an endocrine system kind of a disease that produces unusual results. Like he has a very long neck and very spindly arms and a bloated body, as according to the statues and what we see on the papyri, demonstrating this unusual pharaoh. And remember how I said if it had to be written down, then it probably isn't the truth? Well, if you look at the 18th century kings list, and it listed all the pharaohs during the 18th century, this pharaoh was left off of it. So they actually dug up these colossal statues, and they couldn't figure out in the early 1900s, they couldn't figure out who this was. He broke all the rules of art. We only used to see two-dimensional flat depictions of the pharaohs throughout time, and they were perfection because they are the living gods upon earth. So they had to be drawn and reproduced in perfection. Well, this pharaoh certainly broke all the rules of art. He showed himself with his family, sitting with his children, sitting on his lap under the rays of the autumn sun. And he had sculptors sculpt him in the most unusual ways. And the people at that time, the Amen priests, the Hanuti, still continued in the Amen priesthood during this pharaoh's time, called him the heretic pharaoh. The heretic pharaoh. Well, that's certainly still what is presented in our Egyptology classes. He's the heretic pharaoh. And I think we're getting wise enough now to know that history is written by the victors. So if you're not a victor, it doesn't mean that you could have been a righteous pharaoh, that you wanted free education, that you wanted free hospitalization for your people, that you wanted to feed your people and considered one of the righteous pharaohs. You would still be known as the heretic pharaoh for all culture to deem that was perhaps ill-fated and ill-named. Let's go to the next slide, please. So this is his consort. You may recognize her. This is Queen Per-At Nefertiti. And in Egyptology classes, we're taught that Nefertiti means the beautiful one has come. The beautiful one has come. Beauty is quite superficial. Hakim would say that Nefer actually means harmony, and Titi means baby steps. So it really means she who walks in harmony. Excuse me, and I didn't realize it at the time, but my mother had the bust of Nefertiti on our mantle. It took me years to realize that Pharaoh Akhenaten and Queen Nefertiti were actually consorts of each other and married. It took me until my 20s to discover that their eldest daughter's name is Merrie P. And so then as I progressed, I began to really delve deeply into the mysteries of this pharaoh. And Hakim would say that that Akhenaten has Oriental eyes, Asiatic eyes, a Negroid nose, and a Caucasian mouth. So what does that mean? It really means that he represents all the people. So I thought that was a beautiful depiction. Go ahead and go to the next. So if we talk about those radiating streams of light, I drew this out because this was part of my master's degree, the evolution of God consciousness in ancient Egypt, because I really wanted to delve into this. And so I drew out all the streams of where those rays could possibly have met, and that's where all the temples are along the Nile. So I thought that was an interesting kind of depiction. Go to the next slide. But look at this. This is Pharaoh Akhenaten worshiping the Aten, and there's another depiction of the rays or the streams with a circle around it. And so what is the Aten? It's you would think that it meant that the sun in our sky represented consciousness, and Pharaoh Akhenaten's writings say that consciousness falls on every living creature and that it's available to absolutely everyone. We don't need to hide it away. We don't need to go like the Amen priesthood, who's the god of the invisible realm. And so that's why the Holy of Holies is depicted in a dark room. You can go to some of the temples like in Edfu and you will see a very dark room. That statue of Amen would have been there, and it would have been washed and polished and bestowed with beautiful, beautiful oils and prayers every morning and flowers and food set before it for it to consume. But only a very small percentage of priests were ever allowed to even ever see the statue of Amen, because it was for the invisible realm. Akhenaten comes along and says, absolutely not. I want worship available to all. And so he would depict it, often with an orange sun, depicting the sky, the sun in the sky that everyone visibly could look up and look. But it also could have been the great central sun, Alcyone, and that is a more sacred form of worship, because that's subtle light that falls upon every one of us and allows us to activate our consciousness. Let's go to the next slide, please. So if we talk about the stages of consciousness, I think this is an interesting one. So Hakim would teach us that Khefri would have been the dawn of consciousness. And that's when the sun just initially peaks over the mountains. And so you see just the beginning of sunrise, right? So the beginning of sunrise, that's called the beginning of the Great Awakening, because as the sun rises, so do the people. They start to wake up. And even we know today, some people's alarms went off at 6 a.m. and some people aren't going to wake up until, 9, 10, 11. And there's evolution and different stages of consciousness waking up, but this is the first one. This is called Khefri, and it's the dawn of consciousness, and it's represented by the scarab beetle. The scarab beetle that pushes that ball of dung. That's Khefri is known as the driller, and he's the scarab that pushes consciousness. And Akeem, when he was alive during Arab Spring, he believed that that was the dawn of consciousness, that when people rose up in Egypt, against their form of government at that time, that he said he believed that he was so excited to see that because that was the dawn of consciousness. That means that the age of darkness, light was starting to filter in. So you can say that we are again, if we've been in the age of Amen since the time of the great cataclysm of Atlantis, that we've been in this age of darkness, the age of Amen. But now we're moving into the dawn of consciousness. Next slide. So Khefri, the dawn of consciousness. The next one comes back as Ra, the stubborn, the ram. And so that would have been during like the age of Aries. And you could see, that there was wartime during that. The next one is the wise. Next stage, right at the height of enlightenment, would have been Aten, called the wiser. And it's when kind of the old man resting on his cane, you can imagine the wizened one, we get that from. And it's where the word vizier comes from. Vizier comes from the word wiser. And then we fall again, and this is cyclical. We fall back into the age of Amen, or the dark or hidden one. And these cycles have been going on all through time. This isn't just particular to the fall of Atlantis. These cycles, although we may not have any evidence of them, they certainly have been going on a long time. So next slide. I wanted to see you. So this is a statue of Amen, the hidden one. Next slide. And again, this is another statue of Pharaoh Akhenaten. And you can see the Asiatic eyes, the Negroid nose, and the Caucasian lips, meaning the sesh, meaning that he represents everyone. Next slide, please. So I was fortunate enough to go to Amarna, and I've been to Amarna twice. And I actually took this picture, and it is the Aten coming over. Aten stands for Akhet Aten, which is the horizon. And so it's when the sun comes up over the horizon. And I was fortunate enough at sunrise to be able to take this picture. So that meant a lot to me in my journey. Next slide, please. And I have written about this journey in my paranormal historical novels about ancient Khemit. My first book is Shadow of the Sun. And I talk again, teach really in the form of what the wisdom keepers taught me and my studies and my journeys about ancient Khemit, told through the eyes of Merrie, which is the eldest daughter of Queen Nefertiti and Pharaoh Akhenaten. And I tell it from the point of view of a child because it's rather complex. So at least she is learning at the knee of her mother, as all good Khemitian children do. And so she gets to ask those hard questions. And so my paranormal historical novel about ancient Egypt. The second one is Stealing the Shadow of Death. And I talk about what they really did with mummies. And I talk about a lot of the initiations that Merrie went through during her travels as the Pharaoh's daughter. And with that, I want to say alhamdulillah, all blessings to you and to the wisdom of the gods and goddesses that come through me.
Oh, thank you. This was fascinating. Okay, I've got a couple of questions for you.
Great.
The Ankh, you can see it coming as, and it was depicted in other images where the Ankh is coming down from the great central sun.
Yes.
What could you talk about the Ankh a little bit?
It's one of the simple symbols of power in Egypt. It's one of the great protection items. You can see many of us wear the Ankh around our neck. it's, again, steeped in sacred symbolism. So if you can imagine that it is a womb on the top with the loop, but it's also a phallus entering it. And when the phallus and the womb are joined together, that's called the Sephidet. And so that is when the Merkaba, as the pyramid of the masculine, points down, and the pyramid of the female points up. And so when those two are joined, the Sephidet creates the Merkaba. And so it you can say that the Ankh is a key to life, right? So
Right. Well, I wondered, and I have no idea where I got this idea. I wondered if it was an energy device because,
absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely.
that in some cases somebody's holding it from the round side. The other times they're holding it from the stem side, and you could see them using it in some way over a body.
I love that. That's very intuitive, Kathy. Why don't we take it further? Why don't we say that it may be a key to open portals?
Ah,
Certainly, we have seen that the Anunnaki carry those little purses. And we are seeing more and more depictions all the time of why do they always carry that purse? And you can see that most of the pharaohs carry the Ankh. And so you have to know that that's significant. And the foot four that they lead into the Mintian realms, which are the next portal, are called the heaven realms.
okay. So then the other device that and I don't know that I'll find the slide of it, so I'm going to remove this real quick, is a device that someone in Sedona that I know recreated. That's a metal. He has them in copper and brass, and they have lines like plates on it. It's about he wears it. He has them as pendants, but you can see them in a lot of the graphics where they're a I don't know how to explain it. It's like a brass um, uh, centered, maybe 4-inch tall a piece, and then it has lined other brass circular. Um, it's not woven like a spiral, but they're separate plates, and you see that in a lot of the artwork as well. Are you familiar with that? Is a
Not familiar with that,
energy?
but I do have a set of the copper rod and that you hold in each of the hands, and I use that in my healing method sometimes. It elevates consciousness, and it makes you kind of a conductor of
Yeah,
energy. And
that makes
so we do love copper. Yes.
okay. Okay, so another question about you mentioned the fact that these pyramids were never tombs, that
Correct.
they were energy devices. Could you
Mhm.
share a little bit more about that?
That isn't truly my specialty, other than being in the pyramid. I believe that they are, if anyone's been in the Great Pyramid in the King's Chamber, you can see the rose quartz sarcophagus. And part of being on tour in the pyramid is you get to go lie in the sarcophagus. I don't think people really understand the value of that, other than it makes a great, selfie. It's really, it's an interdimensional portal, and it's how the pharaohs used to travel interdimensionally because they had no physical access to travel, and it's how they would go up and get the star wisdom from the star gods. And my mentor said that he believed that is how Thoth was able to write the emerald, ruby, and sapphire tablets, right?
Oh,
So he
I've
was
only
able,
heard of the emerald tablets.
right.
There's
There's more. There's more than that. And so fortunate when I got to go lay in the sarcophagus, I said, I'm going to try this out, right? So you can astral project, and you can go, anywhere you want to gain that incredible wisdom. So it's one of those things, they don't tell you how to do it, but it's certainly available if you know how.
yeah. Well, I've heard many people talk about that, and also at one point I was in a class and someone was reflecting on their past lives where that was an initiation chamber as well.
Absolutely.
Some
And
people
that is
died.
in my third book.
Oh,
Yes. My Red Lion Shadow, which I'm just starting to get ready to bring it, to editing. It's, yes, I talk exactly about that initiation. But not only do you lie in the sarcophagus, the Hierophant watches over you. And so then they close the lid. Can you imagine the grinding of the stones as they close the lid, and how the initiate has to overcome that fear that they're going to suffocate and that they're going into a tomb? And so part of that, they have to project their consciousness out, and then they have to answer questions. So when they return, they are quizzed very heavily. And if they don't return with the correct wisdom, then they don't pass the test.
right. And apparently that was death.
For many, yeah.
Yeah.
If you haven't learned how to control the rhythm of your heart, control your breathing, slow that down, overcome fear of darkness, fear of enclosed spaces. Maybe that's why so many of us can't stand to be
We're claustrophobic.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, so one more question, then we'll end our one. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. What are you hoping that people will learn from finding out the true nature or the true history of our being?
I think we need to wake up. I think it's just another form of waking up and elevating our consciousness, and really that if it's written down, it isn't necessarily the truth. That there's always a greater truth. There's always greater wisdom that we could be had. Sometimes we just have to open our mind and get out of the rigidity that if it's taught to us under authority, that it's the only truth and we have to follow those lines. I think many of us are having these experiences that we could broaden our consciousness now and take in greater wisdom and take in kind of an eclectic understanding of other cultures that maybe we don't necessarily know at all from a European, Eurocentric point of view. And I think what I have begun to learn, because it's not taught, although I did question it quite a bit when I was in my classes and they didn't like it. It's like, why do all the pharaohs and parrots look so European? And so even with statue of Nefertiti, that's a very, very famous bust that's sold all over the world.
Right,
and certainly the one that I have, she has very, very Caucasian skin. And I started questioning going, if Egypt is in Africa, why wouldn't we see a more melanated complexion?
Right.
And I think that's absolutely imperative, is we can't take the melanation out of the people because it doesn't fit our point of view. And so I think really giving the melanated people the right to their true heritage and waking up and giving true honoring to the lineages that are so profound, and the ones who built the pyramids, the one who created some of the greatest works, needs to really be attributed back in true honoring and in true fashion. Now, we did want to talk about near-death experience. I just want to briefly mention that because I watched it on your other shows, and I wanted to talk about my near-life experience. So I was in the Great Pyramid, and we were doing the final closure of it, and I had some contact with Jehudi or Thoth, and he said, I want to give you a final initiation in the tomb of the pyramid. And he goes, I want you to go to the center of the tomb. And he told me to gather 6 people who we had traveled through each temple with. And he said, please, take your place in the center of the pyramid, and we will conduct this initiation. And so I saw that the teacher, the tour guide, was in the center of the pyramid, and there's no way that I was going to get into the center. And so I said, Thoth, hey, I'm sorry, I just can't pull this off. Maybe next time. And in a booming voice, he said, ye of little faith, if you can't go to the center of the pyramid, I will bring the center of the pyramid to you. And literally 6 of us listened as the gears grinded, and all of a sudden we were under the center of the pyramid. And as we completed what he asked us to do, he said, he asked me, what would you like to receive? And I said, I'll take ascension. Absolutely, right now. This is in 2009. And he goes, I will grant that to you. And I'm like, great, I'm going to ascend with my kids, my family. This is so great. And he says, oh, no. You can't bring your kids. I said, what? I can't bring my kids? And he said, no, they're on their own karma. And I go, okay, well, I can go, right, and take my body. He goes, oh, no, you'd have to leave your body here. And I go, I can't drop dead in the pyramid. I said, you know how bad that would be for tourism? And he goes, okay, think of something else. And I said, oh my gosh, I would like to have a greater understanding of Egypt and more understanding about initiations. And 2 weeks later, after I left Egypt, I'm thinking I'm a complete fool. I live in Boulder, Colorado, and that's completely ridiculous. And then I get a call, and I was introduced to my next mentor. And strangely enough, in 2013, when we had the floods here in Boulder, and my house was completely flooded, and I had to go down and scoop up my artifacts and bring them upstairs. All my books I had to bring upstairs with galoshes, marching through a foot of water in my basement, and bring up all my beautiful books. And I exhausted myself. And we were without electricity, without heat, without water, and we were living in a war zone. Basically, it was pretty scary, and we had no access really to warm food, and couldn't drive into town because there was water surrounding us. And I got a bacterial infection, and then it morphed into a viral infection. And then when the water receded, we discovered that there was black mold on the bottom of my beautiful wooden cabinet that I didn't know I was inhaling. And so it started to morph into strep, and it ate away the left ventricle of my heart. And my husband rushed me into emergency, where the doctor came in and said, you could die at any minute. You can die at any minute. And I'm going, I don't even know your name. And he goes, you need heart surgery immediately. And so after he introduced himself to me, and I said, so what's the problem? And as he explained it to me, I'm like, oh, yeah, okay. I could just pray and see if I could fix it. And a week later, they rushed me into surgery. And I was above my body. I was with all the masters, and consciously, surprisingly enough, having conversations where we're laughing while my body was being operated on. And I thought, I think this is going to hurt, and I don't think I want to come back to this. So I thought it would probably be easier to leave. And so I didn't necessarily have a near-death experience. I had a near-life experience, because as I started to leave, one of my kids, I said, I probably should go tell him I'm leaving. And so I thought to my child in China at the time, and to my other child who was out of state, Mommy wants to go. And so they were saying, no, you can't go, because, what about our weddings? What about this? What about that? What about, grandchildren? And I'm thinking, oh, okay, I'll come back. And I remember hearing the God source say, oh, no, you absolutely can come. And I said, no, I have seen movies. You guys send people back all the time. People are always talking about how they're thrown back. And they said, well, you can do that, but you'd have to tell us, a plan for this, and what's your plan for the next 50,000 years? Who could think that fast? But I remember looking at one of the masters, and I was thinking, if I make this decision between life and death, can you at least please tell me, give me an idea of why we come here? What is the purpose of life? Why do we come to earth and go through all the trials and tribulations that so befall so many of us on this planet? And he goes, my dear, because that is an interesting question. He goes, I have heard that the reason you come to earth is for the pizza, the beer, and the sex. And I go, what? That is the secret of life? Pizza, beer, and sex? I said, you got to be kidding me. I said, I don't even drink beer. So, okay, maybe mine is chocolate and motherhood. And So that's my near life experience.
That's great. Well, we'll have to do this again so that we can hear more of that. But thank you so much, and I hope people will share and share this information so that people even know that there's another history and start to wonder about their heritage and their capability to be vessels of light. This is really a beautiful, beautiful path to more knowledge for that.
Thank you, Kathy.
Thank
you so much for this
Thank you.
opportunity.
Okay, thank you. And everybody, thank you. Please share.